here today with us talking about liberty in Russia. Vera was born and raised in Moscow. She has a master's degree in journalism from Moscow State University. She also has a master's degree in public policy from Oxford University, where she also was the president of the Oxford Hayek Society. And she is currently pursuing her PhD at King's College in London, where she lives and where she liberty works as a researcher at Zaha Hadid, the probably world's most famous architecture office. So thanks for being with us today. We are really happy to have you, Vera. University, where she also was the president of the Oxford Hayek Society. And she is currently pursuing her PhD at King's College in London, where she lives and where she...
Sorry.
Everything all right now? You hear me fine? Okay. Yes, as I said, the topic of today is going to be the liberty movement in Russia. And you're very close to the liberty movement in Russia, even though you live in London now. In 2012, you were running for office for the Municipal Council of Moscow, and you got elected for the Libertarian Party, and you were thereby the first person ever elected as a libertarian to office in Russia. Maybe we get started by you telling us about how you got involved in politics like that, how you got involved in with libertarian ideals, and why you decided to run for office in Moscow.
Thank you very much, Rick. Yes, this would be a good start, I guess. So I joined I've always been, I should say, critical about, ever since Putin became head of the country, which was already 20 years ago. Unbelievable number. I've been critical, like my parents have been, I should say, classical liberals. They supported the fall of communism. They've never been active in politics, but they probably raised me as a liberty lover. So I have been critical about what was going under Putin, and at some point I realized I want to do something about it. So, well, at first I started working as a journalist when I was 14, but then a few years later I thought I want to join to become more proactive and join some movement. And back there, and I should say it's still the case, the Russian opposition movement is very heterogeneous, very diverse. So in an authoritarian country, you have to be allies with people who not necessarily share your ideology. So it's like, I always say that, yes, I might disagree with people who we stand side by side at a rally, but I would rather debate them in the parliament and not on Facebook. Because we all support the same institution. We all want the free elections. We all want independent media, and it's then that we start debating, like whether we should turn right or left or whatever. So I joined the Libertarian Party 10 years ago, and 2011, 2012 was a very special time for Russia. We had a parliamentary election in late 2011, which were rigged as usual. But what wasn't usual is that it suddenly triggered a very massive protest movement. So the rallies that started in December 11 were the biggest since the fall of the Soviet Union. And I was part of the movement along with my libertarian friends. And it felt like the window someone needs to do something, and that there was a chance for young, unexperienced, but idealistic people to go into politics and try to make a change. So because by then I already had a popular Twitter, we gathered with the Libertarian Party. It was literally in the basement, in a very dark basement, and started deciding what shall we do, since so many people are now suddenly interested in politics. What shall we do to use this moment to spread our ideas? And we decided, okay, Vera should run for office. she has a lot of following on Twitter. She can raise money for that. And yeah, that's what happened. I raised enough money on Twitter. I had a campaign, both online and offline. We were going from door to door, talking to my neighbors, and that was in my own neighborhood. It was where I grew up. So that was part of my campaign, that I was a local person with local knowledge. But the other part of my campaign was that I campaigned for more transparency, more decentralization, more accountability. And yes, that was to my surprise, but I woke up and checked the results and found out that I'm a counselor now.
Yeah, so obviously you did a good job on that. But maybe one thing we can talk about, because I guess it's rather difficult for us here in Western Europe to understand, is how is it like to be an opposition politician in Russia, because the stories we hear from the media, critical journalists and opposition leaders not only being detained and intimidated, but even being killed in the city center of Moscow. I guess it's very different for a political activist or opposition politician in Russia than it would be for us here in Western Europe. Like, I can hardly imagine how that is. Can you talk a bit about that? What challenges you faced or your colleagues still face today?
There is all sort of challenges. So there's the challenges that are posed by there are outright threats. Yes, as you mentioned, you can be detained, you can be, in an exceptional case, killed, but you have to be. So the case that you referred to, just to explain it to everyone else, there was Boris Nemtsov, who was one of the leaders of the Russian liberal opposition, and he was killed just in front of the Kremlin in central Moscow. It was 5 years ago. So, and that was, for many, it was a turning point when a lot of people dropped out of politics, because it was suddenly, we always knew that it's risky, but there was a different kind of risk. So, but if you're an activist, not a big opposition leader, you still face a lot of, it's still risky. So, and it's becoming more and more risky. So, for example, one of the things that's been really deteriorating in the last 5 to 10 years is the freedom of speech online. So now people get fined, arrested, and even jailed for what they post online, what they retweet, repost, like. And this is something that was unimaginable even, definitely 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago even. So we've always had instances of censorship, but they were not that, it wasn't something routine that would happen on a daily basis. And the thing is, yes, this is the clever strategy that the Russian government is using, that many people that get into that suffer from that kind of, that get arrested, jailed unfairly, they are not opposition leaders, they are not people with a lot of followers, subscribers, that not public people, they're just random people. So it makes everyone feel like you can be the next one. So this strategy, so I mentioned this huge rallies that we had back in 2012. So this is basically how it all ended. The government chose a very cynical and a very effective, unfortunately, strategy that at one of these rallies, they arrested several hundred people, and several dozens of them were accused of preparing mass riots and plotting against the regime. So, and they were random people. Some of them were not even part of the protest; they were just passing by, and there was a very public process, and they got jail sentences from like up to 6 years in prison. And this is when everyone understood that it's not a joke. And this is effectively how they managed to silence the movement for a couple of years. But of course not forever. So there were big rallies in 2016. They were rallies last summer in Moscow for something you would never expect to be a trigger for a movement like that. It was local elections in Moscow. So and I thought it was, so on the one hand, it showed that yes, there are so many people are just angry about what was happening that anything could be a trigger. But on the other hand, I would say that local issues became a more important thing. People started realizing that it's bottom up, that you can make a stable change. And I'm happy to think I might have contributed to that when I was in a council.
Yes. Maybe we can talk about one or two specific examples. You mentioned the freedom of speech online became more difficult. One of the examples I heard about was Sergei Boyko. I think he's the leader of the Libertarian Party, and he was arrested for a couple of days because he Twittered something. Can you talk about that? Because it really sounds ridiculous what he did and that he got arrested for. Can you talk about what happened there?
Yes, I'm really pleased that you keep an eye on that and remember, because yes, the Libertarian Party of Russia is doing very brave and amazing things, and I'm always happy and I'm always thankful to our friends and colleagues from other countries for supporting it, for spreading the word. And yes, it was during those protests last summer, which I mentioned, which started after a number of independent candidates for the Moscow Council were not registered. They were not registered as candidates. So, and yes, Boyko, as the leader of the Libertarian Party, was in the center of the movement. He was active and as an organizer, and yes, he just reposted an announcement of a public gathering, of a rally, which ridiculously didn't even happen. So and he reposted it. He didn't announce a rally. He didn't organize it. It was just a repost, and yeah, he had to spend 2 weeks in a detention center for that. So something that happened to many people who were last summer, who were perceived as the leaders of the movement. So if I were in Moscow, probably that would have happened to me as well. I've been arrested 6 times in my political career.
What have you done to get arrested?
Well, every time it was some public rally. So, and twice out of these 6 times I was there as a journalist. So I had a document showing that I represent the media, but they didn't stop the police from arresting me. This is also, so for journalism, it's because, as you mentioned, my first degree was in journalism, and I've been working as a journalist for about 10 years. And when I graduated back in 2000, so when I was studying it 10 years ago, there was still plenty of independent media that journalist graduate could work for if he or she didn't want to be involved in propaganda. Now there's barely any. There are a few, but there are a few. Some of them are based outside of Russia. They have their headquarters based because for the safety reasons, for the safety of the staff. Some of them are in Russia, but they were like a lot of their audience was cut off as a result of some. So some of them were blocked online. So there was a number of legislations that, like for example, the legislation that banned online advertising. So I won't go into details, but everyone realized that this particular legislation was targeting this particular media. So it's essentially the media I worked for, it was back in 2014. I published it was a satirical article about the secessionist movement in Siberia. So there wasn't even a real movement. It was kind of a mockery in a response to Russia supporting the separatists in Ukraine. And a group of performance artists in Siberia, they started this mockery movement of Siberia seceding from Russia. And I interviewed them, and we got a letter from the Russian censorship agency. If you get too like this, your media gets blocked. So okay, that's my personal experience of facing censorship. But that was 5 years ago. So, and it's got really worse since then.
Yeah, that doesn't sound that there's too much reason for optimism right now. How do you see the chances of the pro-liberty movement in Russia? Do you see any hope that they might gain some momentum or might be influential or change the course of Russian politics for good?
So we're switching to the optimist part now.
And I hope there is one, yes?
Yes, I should say we already gained a momentum. Because all the recent rallies with I don't know, up to 20,000 people, which for Moscow, yes, which is a very big thing given what I just told you, how dangerous it is to be openly protesting against the regime. They were organized by the Libertarian movement. So in the last few years, the Libertarian Party of Russia is basically, I should say, one of the two biggest opposition and most influential opposition movements, together with Alexei Navalny's supporters. Navalny, he was the presidential candidate from the opposition several years ago. So we are very big. We started, as I told you, as a bunch of nerds gathering in the basement in Moscow, discussing Hayek and Mises, and we started from the education. So we started organizing educational events, more or less what we are doing here now, and what Students for Liberty is doing. But now we have representatives in over 50 regions in Russia. And what I told you about how dangerous it is, I was talking about Moscow. So you can imagine that in more remote places, it's even more dangerous and risky to be involved in this, because there's, well, for many reasons. And we have people who call themselves libertarians and do libertarian activism on a daily basis, from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad to Khabarovsk to St. Petersburg to Sochi, anywhere. And so Rick, you know this very well because you were two years ago, you spoke at the Adam Smith Forum in Moscow, which is our annual educational conference, and there was 1,500 people. You saw it with your own eyes, so you can confirm it.
Yes, absolutely true. But that's why I want to talk about this, because I was so impressed. Like people are desperate for the ideas of liberty. I had the impression when I was in Moscow, and it was the autumn of 2018, I think. As you said, we had far more than 1,000 students at this conference the whole day, talks and debates, and students, young people were sitting on the benches of the windows and standing in the back of the conference hall all day just to listen to those libertarian speakers. So yeah, I was overwhelmed by this. So I'm curious, like, how comes that people feel this desperate interest in those ideas? Is it really, is it hope? Is it, what is it that brings them to you and the ideas of liberty?
I should say this is a mix of hope for the future and a feeling of being tired of what's going on. So you probably noticed, because you're in the SFL, so you're familiar with the liberty movements all over. You're familiar with liberty activists from all over the world. You might have noticed that in countries that have lived under dictatorships, especially under the communist regimes like Eastern Europe and Latin America, and people who live currently in authoritarian regimes, it's sometimes, and it's not surprising to me that the liberty movements there can be bigger and stronger. In Russia, for example, so why so many people, why more and more people join the libertarian movement? Because it's in some way, it's even easier to promote libertarian ideas in a country like Russia, because nobody is expecting anything good from the government. So it's very, you don't have to, it's quite easy to persuade a person that the government is not doing anything good, anything right. So people would without, you don't need an ideology to be suspicious of the government. And people who are very far from any political movement, might just think that the best thing the government can do is leave them alone.
Yeah. And you not only have the Libertarian Party in Russia, you have a pretty diverse pro-liberty movement. You also have Students for Liberty, at least a little chapter. You have something like Pussy Riot, and maybe you can talk about how that's maybe linked to other just opposition fractions, movements that might also fight for liberty, even if not in the libertarian sense. So can you talk about maybe about the diversity within the pro-liberty movement? Like what other actors beside the Libertarian Party and Students for Liberty do you have?
I would say that they've been, so in the last few years, they've been less political activism and more social activism, human rights activism. Because honestly, everybody understands that there's not much opportunity for winning the office unless on a local level, like I did. And it becomes more and more risky to be involved in politics. But there is a lot of people involved in human rights organizations who are supporting people facing oppression, supporting people who are persecuted for their views. There are groups, what should I, yes, so you mentioned Pussy Riot, there's the feminist movement growing, there's what can I say about, what else should I say about, so there are groups that are active each in their own domain. So there are groups that are working on okay. How should I translate it? Like, for example, the drug policy and harm reduction. There are groups that are working like against censorship, internet, like online activists and people who are campaigning for less, state surveillance online and more freedom of speech, freedom of internet, which started. So that's the first big rally that was organized by the Libertarian Party. It was in support of the Telegram messenger, which you probably heard about. It's an encrypted messenger which was founded by a Russian businessman who's in exile now. And so that's a lot of people got involved into this movement because they were, as we would say, Zoomers. So they grew up, they are digital natives, they grew up online, and they were very annoyed when they realized that the government wants to infringe on what they believed was their domain. So a lot of people get politicized and joined our party as well, because they were angry about censorship of internet. Yeah, so we have people who are campaigning for like local environmental issues, who are yes, and there are a lot of, as I said, so in 2012, it was when I was running for office, it was something new. But since then, there have been a lot of people all over Russia who realized that they can make a change on a local level and who ran for their office and won. So we now have several other elected members of the party. And the last time there were local elections in Moscow, there were several. So when I was elected, there was also like a network of independent councillors, but the network was like 30, 40 people. Now we had several hundred people who got, and there are councils which are dominated by the opposition, which was unimaginable just 5 years earlier. So I should say that the bottom up movement is getting stronger. And even though I don't see, honestly, we don't see any possibility of changing Putin to somebody else in the next few years. But when people learn to solve their daily problems without the government through cooperation, when there are organizations that are building up social capital, that's like, in the long run, this is what will happen, what will help us to to end Putin's rule.
Yeah, yes, I'm glad that you mentioned it, the ineffable name Putin. As I see the already incoming questions, or some are already targeting also Putin, and of course Putin is like the central figure in Russian politics, at least when you look at Russia from outside. But I'm always wondering, I mean, of course Putin is the central figure and very important in this system, but I'm wondering, like, if Putin would retire tomorrow, like, I guess most of the system, most of the problems would still be in place, because I guess it's an entire system, like it's a power architecture that supports this system. There are many people profiting from this system. So is it really like Putin who's to blame for all of it, and would all the problems be solved when Putin disappears if he would step back tomorrow? Or I guess there would still be many problems would be the same even if Putin would be gone, if it's tomorrow or in 5 or 10 or whatever years. Like, can you talk about that? Putin on the one hand and the system that supports him on the other hand, and what could and should be done to actually implement a freer society in Russia?
There is a very, I should say, dangerous narrative spread by some experts on Russian politics abroad that Putin is basically a hostage of the system, that he was forced to build the system that he built, that it was his surrounding that basically created it. This is very dangerous because it's like, it makes us think that Putin is almost a victim of what's going on. He deliberately created a system in which he is the ultimate person to make any major decision. So, and he wants us in Russia and to think, he wants every Russian to believe that if Putin goes away, there will be a catastrophe. And unfortunately, the system that he created is like that. It's not going to be a catastrophe, but yes, he is the single decision maker for all the major things, and there's a vertical system in which he's on top, and there is no opposition within the government. They used to be, before 2012, they used to be what we would call like the liberal wing in the Kremlin, the conservative wing in the Kremlin. But since then, when he believes that the so-called liberal wing was partially responsible for those rallies 2012. So he's been consciously eliminating it and getting rid one by one of all the people in his surrounding who were at least somehow believed to be more liberal, more open-minded, more global-minded. So yes, but he wants us to believe that nobody, like in a country of 140 million people, there is really nobody, no single person to replace an elderly dictator who fails to perform this like the social policy, fails to work on the social policy. Right now, he fails to respond to do an adequate response to the pandemic. So there's literally not a single person in the whole Russia to replace him. Of course, that's not right, but that's what he wants us to believe. And they would always say that if tomorrow we have a free election, then Putin will still win because he's still the most popular person. But free election is not just going to the polls. Free elections starts from free media, when everyone is free to campaign. And there was a hilarious story during last summer when we had these Moscow elections. There was in one of the constituencies, there was an opposition candidate who wasn't registered by the administration as a candidate, but because he was somehow popular, they managed to find the administration managed to find a person with the same name, whom nobody ever saw before, and that person won. They couldn't find that person after the elections. Like, everyone was wondering where this person was and who it was. So the people are so tired of the ruling party, the United Russia, that they would vote for no names. Just so it's not that people vote for Putin because they think there's no alternative, but Putin wants us to believe there's no alternative. And there is, whenever you see on a local level, whenever you see the independent candidates winning, there is suddenly a major change towards more transparency. There's suddenly the real political competition. So now it's only possible on a local level, which we see in Moscow. But of course, if there is a fair election starting from the campaigning, we will see a lot of new faces.
Okay, so would you say that Putin is the main problem within the Russian system, and that would change significantly if he would be gone one day? It's no matter when, but like, do you think like the main problem would be solved if Putin would be gone one day, or what do you think?
A large part of the problem will be solved, but it won't, like, suddenly overnight it won't magically become a different society. And so my favorite example deals with Germany. Favorite example of like the healthy and unhealthy societies. So as I mentioned, I talked earlier about social capital and the power of horizontal networks. And if you look 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the German Institute for Labor made a study they compared social capital, which is basically the numerical representation of trust that people have, and it is translated into all sort of positive things, from the amount of people engaged in entrepreneurship to the amount of NGOs and charities. And there is still, 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a very significant difference between Eastern and Western problem. And you can see the same problem in other post-communist countries. So, and the same in Russia, when for decades and decades, the government has been crowding out private initiative, bottom-up initiative from all sort of people's lives. Then it will take some time to rebuild this trust. It will take some time for people to learn to cooperate, learn to trust each other. It will take some time to restore these institutions. But this is, as I said, something you can do without waiting for Putin to leave. So the legacy of the Soviet regime is still haunting the Russian society. So it will. So I lived in Ukraine for a couple of years after the Ukrainian Revolution, and I saw this very vividly with my own eyes, how powerful this. So Ukraine was going through this process of decommunization, as they called it, getting rid of the communist legacy. And it was clearly seen that better later than never. It was still 30 years after the end of the regime, but it was a very powerful movement. And this is after that, I think for Ukraine, it wasn't yes, Ukraine needs a lot of economic reforms, but this is an entirely different topic. But still, it was very powerful, and it means like you cut off this authoritarian past, and there's in some way there's no turning back. So Russia should go through this as well, better later than never.
Yeah. So would you say Russia is still in this post-communist transition?
Well, we still have a hammer and sickles as decorative elements on many government buildings. We still have a quote about Stalin as the father of the nations in the Moscow underground, one of the stations. We still have some. Stalin is still one of the most popular figures in the Russian history. So, and by the way, I know there is a bunch of people who believe that at least 20 years ago that the Putin's regime is neoliberal, pro-capitalist. Well, take anyone in the Russian government. Almost everyone used to be members of the Communist Party, and none of them publicly denounced their membership. So these are the same people most of them are the same people who used to be in the, should I say, nomenclature before the regime change. So, and yeah, you can. There's a lot of research on that, where comparing the post-communist countries, and there is a very clear pattern that in countries that had the complete change of the completely new faces in the government, not just the new name for an ideology, not just the same people who suddenly overnight became liberal. These countries also performed much better in economic reforms, in social reforms. And I'm talking about countries like the Baltic countries, for example, where the communist symbols are treated similarly as the Nazi symbols. So to me, they should be on the same level.
Yeah. What I was also wondering about, do you have an idea of how this COVID-19 situation might impact the situation? Because usually we see in such a pandemic situation a rise of authoritarianism. You know, people are looking for great leaders to solve this huge problem. Did you notice any of that kind in Russia? Do you have an idea how that might impact the situation in Russia?
Oh, I mean, I'm afraid you're right in some sense, because there was a big gift to the authoritarian leaders worldwide, because nobody cares about human rights anymore. We have a bigger problem to solve, and so within your own country, and also the current situation normalized a lot of things that we as libertarians should be very suspicious about, like surveillance, and so restrictions of human movement, and and in democratic countries we can expect this to be reversed. I'm afraid not fully, but at least I mean after the epidemic is over. But in countries like Russia, I don't think it will be. I mean, it will be just. I don't think it will be reversed. So, and also Putin wanted to before the epidemic struck. It was the so-called referendum was planned, which would amend the Russian constitution and basically gave Putin the chance to be a leader, like the president for life. Should I say Tsar? I don't know. And it was postponed, but now I think, yes, Putin can, he can do whatever he wants. He can organize the voting online, which will be even harder to supervise. And but surprisingly, on another hand, he's not playing a strong leader now, quite the opposite. So I don't know, we can argue a lot about what we call like the Italian model, the Swedish model, the UK model. In Russia, there was no model, there's just chaos. So up until so the Russian government was completely ignoring what was going on. And then suddenly overnight, they announced a complete lockdown. And nobody understands, there's no strategy, nobody understands what's happening. So, and Putin is not playing in this specific topic. On this specific topic, he's not acting as a leader. So suddenly he said that it's up to the governors. So for years, for 2 decades, he's been building up this vertical system in which nobody, like there was like the regions had zero autonomy and all the decisions were made in Moscow. But now he's saying like, do whatever you think is right, because he doesn't want to take responsibility for the effect of the epidemic.
Do you think this will affect the acceptance of Putin in the long run? Because we have one incoming question asking, why is there still such a high acceptance for Putin in Russia? Do you think that might change because of that situation?
Well, they say that some polls show that his rate of support is falling, but it doesn't make any difference now because you cannot have rallies, because even the referendum was postponed. We usually have elections in September, which probably will be postponed as well. So even if his rate of support is falling, so what? By the time people will be allowed to go out again, they might fix it because they totally control the media. But at the same time, so speaking about the rate of support, I think all these numbers are very misleading, because you never know the real rate of support of the government in an authoritarian country when people are afraid to say what they really think. And this has already happened in Russian history. A year before the Soviet Union collapsed, there was the so-called referendum when people all over the Soviet Union were asked whether they wanted to keep the system as it was or reform it somehow. And over 90% voted for keeping Soviet Union as it was. And the next year it collapsed. And apparently it did because the majority was happy with it. So that's how much that shows you whether you should trust the polls in countries like this.
Yeah. So another hot topic coming in from Andres on YouTube. What do people in Russia think about the situation in Crimea and parts of Georgia? Do you have any idea, comment on that? What's the public opinion on what's going on there?
Well, as for the Crimea, it was I think the major turning point during Putin's rule, Putin's 20 years of rule. The annexation of Crimea was it started a new era of Putin. So, and a very, very massive propaganda campaign was started to to make people kind of proud that Crimea is now Russian. There's a big rejoinder. So it's very sad, but I should say still the majority of Russians, they not just accepted that Crimea is the part of Russia, but they're very proud of it, and it would be very when the situation goes back to normal, which I hope will happen in my lifetime, of hopefully sooner than later, then it will still be very it will be difficult to change the public opinion. But at the same time, this is exactly the Crimean crisis was when the biggest crackdown on independent media happened. So that was very, very important for Putin to make everyone supportive of that move. Yes, as for Georgia, I think most people, if you ask on the street, wouldn't even recognize what you're talking about. So the Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which were in a similar manner, but not quite similar, annexed from Georgia in 2008. Most people, because that was not such a big campaign in the Russian media, so it wasn't. So they wouldn't probably have a strong opinion on that. But so it takes courage to openly, being a politician, a public figure, say that Crimea should belong to Ukraine and should be returned to Ukraine. And I'm proud to say that the Libertarian Party is very serious about it. We've always, so back in 2014 when the annexation happened, we were protesting against it, and we've always been saying that this was absolutely against morally and legally and in any way an unacceptable move.
Yes, I guess that doesn't make it much easier for the Libertarian Party in Russia. So another question from YouTube is, do you see the Libertarian Party winning an election in Russia in your lifetime?
Yes, I do. Absolutely.
Do you have a time frame for that? An optimistic and a pessimistic, maybe?
You never know. These things, who would say just a few months before the Euromaidan in Ukraine that Ukraine would become a new country, that there would be a revolution, that the pro-Putin president will have to flee to Russia, and take any major political change in the world, like a few months before that, nobody would. So there is always a combination of factors. Each of them might be predictable, like economic factors, political factors, geopolitical. But it's when they suddenly everything, all if they suddenly happen all together, and there is a chance there is a window of opportunity, there is a chance for change. But yes, we're now, the party is, as I said, we've grown, we have several thousands of members, I guess. So probably we are, I don't know if we are the second biggest Libertarian Party after the United States, but we're definitely one of the biggest in the world. So, and we have more and more people with experience of running campaigns, not exactly for themselves, but as you can understand, each like seat won in a local parliament requires a teamwork of many people. So my campaign was the first experience, and every year we have more and more people with experience in running electoral campaigns. And in some regions, people who are already in politics, who are already in office, in public office, they join the Libertarian Party when they realize that this is now the biggest independent political movement. So yes, I see that. I see that happening, and I know the people who would be very good in the parliament.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll keep my fingers crossed, of course. Some other incoming questions from our audience are concerned with the international relations. For instance, do you see a chance of betterment for the relations between Russia and the US in the foreseeable future? And what do you think about the effect of the economic sanctions against Russia?
So effect of the sanctions, it was manifold, as I should say. So it definitely was a big economic shock for Russia. So the Russian currency, the ruble, fell dramatically in 2014, and it hasn't recovered ever since. So they've been up and downs. So the sanctions, which were imposed by the Western countries after, I'm talking about the sanctions that were imposed after the annexation of Crimea. But if you talk about sanctions, so there are sanctions against economy and sanctions against particular individuals. And I'm all the way in favor of the latter ones, and I'm not so sure about the former ones. So sanctions against particular people who are involved in human rights violations, in the annexation, in the murders of, in assassination of political opponents. This is, I think, very important because many of those people in the government or who are on top of the propaganda machine, they're very cynical. Their main job is to create this myth of Russia being surrounded by enemies, of the West being the evil, like the Western democratic countries being in fact the evil totalitarian, like decaying, I don't know, so all sort of demonizing the West. But most of them, they have their children living in the West and studying in the Western universities. So the press secretary of Putin has his daughter living in Paris and openly writing on Instagram that she would never go back. So that she's happy living in Paris. She feels like a Parisian. So, and Dmitry Kisilov, who is the face of the Russian propaganda, he's been seen walking in Amsterdam. So he's particularly famous for spreading homophobic views, and Amsterdam is seen like the headquarters of the gay lobby by the Russian, it's shown by the Russian propaganda. So many of them have assets in the West. So for them, this is like the sanctions against certain people is a very, for them, this is really painful. But speaking of the general sanctions against the economy, unfortunately, this in a way this helps the propaganda to reinforces their message that you see the West is trying to harm us because they fear us, because they envy us, because they hate us. So they just use it as another proof that the Western countries want to harm Russia. And they are not feeling, I mean people in the government, people in on top of the propaganda machine, they do not feel it they do not bear the cost of it. Because when they there were sanctions against a number of heads of the Russian state-owned corporation, and the Russian parliament just suggested that we should pay them from the budget money to compensate the heads of the state corporations. So they would just they put the cost of dealing with sanctions on the regular people, and they would say this is the West is doing it with you.
Okay. Frederick writes that he heard that a new Marxist youth movement in Russia is gaining more and more ground and would be competing with the liberal opposition. Have you heard about that? Is that to be taken seriously, or is it an exaggeration? It seems like he's not sure about that himself. Have you heard about that?
I haven't heard about it.
Okay, so you're not concerned about that. Okay,
no.
Great. Since our time is almost up, I'd like to ask you one or two of the more personal questions that came in. For instance, do you have any interesting liberty-related Russian authors you would recommend, other than Ayn Rand?
Nobody comes up from the top of my head, but if I remember somebody, I'll post them I'll post the comment in the SFL group.
Okay, great.
That's a good question, but I'll need to think about it.
Okay. And can you imagine returning to Russia yourself in the near future?
I shouldn't talk. I don't know about the near future, but at some point, yes, probably. As I said, I lived in Kiev, and I moved there after the revolution, and I saw a lot of young or not so young Ukrainians who had experience of studying, living, working somewhere in the West, in the more developed countries, who saw that as an opportunity to change their own country, and who moved back to Ukraine after the change of the regime, and who started working for the government or for some NGOs, helping, trying to take part in the reforms, to be part of that change. And that's when I decided that that's basically how I ended up in Oxford and then in London. I realized that now that probably now that Putin's regime seems stable, probably this is time to become more professional in what I think I can later use to create a better Russia. So for me, this is the cities. I'm writing a dissertation about the future of cities because I had experience, a practical experience of working in the local government. So probably at some point I will be able to come back and take part in reforming the local government, the regional government system, the municipal system in Russia. This is this is an opportunity that I keep in mind.
Yes, sounds great. I wish you all the best for this, as everybody at Students for Liberty does. I thank you so much. Our time is already up. Thanks to everybody who was watching this talk. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to get all the notifications for our future webinars. The next webinar is going to be next Sunday with Yaron Brooks on reason in times of pandemic. So I hope to see you there. I also would like to thank Bada, our technician, who is doing all the work in the background here and who is responsible for everything working smoothly. So thank you, Bada. And of course, thank you again, Vera. It was a great pleasure to have you here tonight at such a short notice. I wish you all the best for your PhD in London and for the freer future for Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick.